In 1994, satellites over North Korea photographed something strange: heat signatures from a reactor the world thought had already been frozen by treaty. By 2006, that same country, a nation that a decade earlier could not feed its own people, where famine killed hundreds of thousands, where farmers were eating tree bark to survive, detonated its first nuclear weapon. Today, it has intercontinental missiles that can theoretically reach American soil. It has, by some estimates, enough material for dozens of warheads. It has submarines. It has satellites. It has one of the fastest growing missile programs on Earth. And here is the part almost nobody explains properly. This didn't happen in isolation. It happened because two of the largest powers on the planet, Russia and China, each had their own reasons to keep this country armed. Not the same reasons, sometimes competing reasons. Both, at different points, quietly useful to Pyongyang. To understand why the poorest country in East Asia became one of the most dangerous, we can't start with the nuclear test. We have to start over 2,000 years earlier, with tribes, kingdoms, and a peninsula that has been fought over by every empire around it since before Rome had emperors. This is that story. Welcome back to Time Layers, where we dig through the layers of history to understand the world we live in now. If you're new here, this is a channel for people who want the why behind the headlines, not just the headlines. If that's you, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's go all the way back to a peninsula in 100 BC, long before there was a north or south anything. Around 100 BC, the Korean peninsula was not one nation. It was a patchwork. Small walled kingdoms and tribal confederacies sitting in the shadow of a much larger neighbor, Han Dynasty China, which had already pushed military commanderies onto Korean soil in the north. Out of that pressure, three kingdoms slowly rose and hardened: Goguryeo in the north, stretching deep into Manchuria, Baekje in the southwest, and Silla in the southeast. For roughly 7 centuries, these three fought each other, allied with each other, and constantly triangulated against outside powers, especially the Chinese dynasties to the west and the Japanese states across the sea to the east. This is worth sitting with, because it's a pattern that never really leaves Korean history: a peninsula squeezed between larger neighbors, each with its own interest in what happens there. It happens with Han China in 100 BC. It happens with Tang China in the 600s. It happens with Qing China in the 1800s. And it happens with Russia and China again in the 21st century. The names change, the geography doesn't. In 668 AD, Silla, allied with Tang China, finally crushed its rivals and unified most of the peninsula for the first time. But that alliance came at a price familiar to smaller nations everywhere. Tang China expected influence in return for its help. Silla had to fight its own former ally to push Chinese forces back out and keep real independence. Getting a bigger power to help you is never free. That lesson repeats itself again and again on this peninsula. In 918, a new kingdom rose from Silla's decline: Goryeo, the name that Korea itself comes from. Goryeo endured Mongol invasions in the 1200s, was eventually forced into vassalage under the Mongol Empire, and survived by doing what smaller states on this peninsula had always done: bending without fully breaking. In 1392, General Yi Seong-ye overthrew the Goryeo court and founded the Joseon dynasty, the longest ruling dynasty in Korean history, lasting over 500 years. Joseon adopted Confucian governance, built a sophisticated bureaucracy, and, critically, positioned itself as a tributary state of Ming and later Qing China. In exchange for symbolic deference, Joseon received trade access, cultural exchange, and, most importantly, a degree of protection. But by the late 1800s, that old order was collapsing. China's Qing dynasty was weakening. A modernizing Japan was rising fast. Russia was expanding into the Far East, eyeing warm water ports. Korea, which had spent centuries closing itself off from the world, earning the nickname the Hermit Kingdom, suddenly found itself the prize in a contest between three empires. Japan won that contest. After defeating China in 1895 and Russia in 1905, Japan formally annexed Korea in 1910. For the next 35 years, Korea existed as a Japanese colony. Its language suppressed, its resources extracted, its people conscripted into forced labor, and, for many women, sexual slavery under the euphemism of comfort women. This colonial trauma is not a footnote. It shapes almost everything that happens next. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. Korea was suddenly free, and suddenly leaderless, with no unified government ready to take over. In the scramble at the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed on something almost administrative in nature. They would temporarily divide the peninsula at the 38th parallel to accept the Japanese surrender. The US would handle the South. The USSR would handle the North. That temporary line never really went away. In the North, the Soviets installed a young Soviet-trained guerrilla fighter named Kim Il-sung. In the South, the US backed Syngman Rhee. Two rival governments formed by 1948, each claiming to be the legitimate ruler of the whole peninsula. 2 years later, in June 1950, Kim Il-sung, with Stalin's approval and Mao's backing, launched an invasion south, starting the Korean War. The war dragged in the United States and a United Nations coalition on one side, and, after UN forces pushed near the Chinese border, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops on the other. It ended in 1953, not with a peace treaty, but with an armistice, a ceasefire that technically has never been formally replaced. North and South Korea are, on paper, still at war today. Here's the detail that matters most for everything that follows. North Korea survived its founding only because of Soviet and Chinese military intervention. From the very first year of its existence, Pyongyang learned a lesson it never unlearned. Its survival depends on playing its two giant neighbors against each other and against the West. After the armistice, North Korea rebuilt with heavy Soviet and Chinese aid, and under Kim Il-sung, it developed Juche, an ideology of self-reliance that ironically was built almost entirely on foreign assistance. The nuclear story starts quietly. In 1959, the Soviet Union signed an agreement to help North Korea with peaceful nuclear research, and by 1965, the USSR had helped build a small research reactor at Yongbyon, the site that would later become the heart of North Korea's weapons program. China, too, shared nuclear expertise with North Korea in the early Cold War years, partly out of ideological solidarity, partly to keep a buffer state between itself and American forces stationed in South Korea. Neither Moscow nor Beijing intended, at the time, to hand North Korea a bomb, but the foundational knowledge, the reactors, the training, the early fuel cycle expertise came from them. North Korea took that foundation and, over decades, kept building on its own, even as its economy collapsed. And collapse it did. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, North Korea lost its main benefactor overnight. Subsidized oil, trade, aid, gone. China, focused on its own economic reforms, pulled back too. The result, through the mid-1990s, was catastrophic. A famine that killed anywhere from several 100,000 to over 1 million people. This is the poverty the Hook mentioned. This is a country where, at the exact moment it was quietly pushing forward its nuclear program, its own citizens were starving.
엄마, 저 배고파요.
Why keep building a bomb while your people starve? Because for the Kim regime, the nuclear program was never really about warfighting. It was insurance. Watching the US-led coalitions topple non-nuclear regimes, most chillingly, Libya's Gaddafi, who gave up his weapons program in 2003 and was overthrown and killed in 2011, reinforced, again and again, one conclusion in Pyongyang: a regime with nuclear weapons doesn't get invaded. In 2003, North Korea withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty entirely. In 2006, it tested its first bomb. 5 more tests followed by 2017, alongside a rapidly advancing missile program, including intercontinental range missiles theoretically capable of reaching the continental United States. This is where the story stops being just history and becomes the news. For most of the last 30 years, China was North Korea's only real lifeline, the source of over 90% of its trade, its fuel, its food. China's interest was never particularly hidden. Beijing wants a stable buffer state on its border, not a collapsed North Korea sending refugees across the Yalu River, and not a unified US-allied Korea with American troops suddenly sitting on China's doorstep. China has repeatedly said it wants denuclearization, but in practice, it has just as consistently avoided the kind of pressure that might actually cause the regime to collapse. A weak, dependent North Korea has long suited China better than a chaotic, unpredictable one. Then Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, and everything shifted. Russia's war machine burned through ammunition faster than its own factories could replace it. North Korea had exactly what Russia needed: enormous stockpiles of Soviet-pattern artillery shells and short-range ballistic missiles sitting mostly unused. In return, North Korea needed exactly what Russia could offer: food, fuel, hard currency, and, most dangerously, advanced military technology that decades of sanctions had kept out of its hands. By June 2024, this arrangement had become official. Putin and Kim Jong-un signed a comprehensive strategic partnership treaty in Pyongyang, reviving a mutual defense clause dating back to 1961, meaning each country is now formally committed to aid the other if attacked. North Korea began sending not just weapons, but soldiers. First thousands, and by 2025 and 2026, reportedly tens of thousands, deployed to fight Russian forces in Kursk and beyond. Analysts estimate North Korea has earned billions of dollars from this arrangement and gained something money can't easily buy: real combat experience for an army that hadn't fought a war in 70 years. And what does Russia's hidden interest actually look like? Increasingly, it's technology. Reporting through 2026 describes Russia running live fire testing and refinement of North Korean missile systems inside occupied Ukraine, reportedly improving their accuracy dramatically, with the improved designs flowing back to Pyongyang. There is credible concern from multiple defense analysts that Russia has begun sharing expertise relevant to satellite reconnaissance, nuclear-powered submarines, and other systems North Korea has wanted for decades, but never had the technical base to build alone. None of this is fully confirmed. Both governments have every incentive to keep it deniable, but the pattern and the public statements from both sides about deepening military cooperation point the same direction. China, meanwhile, watched its exclusive grip on North Korea slip. In 2026, Xi Jinping made Pyongyang his first overseas trip of the year, a rare, high-profile visit widely read as an attempt to remind Kim Jong-un who his oldest and largest patron really is, and to make sure Russia doesn't become the only power North Korea needs. So today, North Korea isn't choosing between China and Russia. It's doing something its founders would recognize instantly: playing both, extracting security guarantees from one and economic lifelines from the other. Exactly as it has tried to balance larger neighbors since the days of Goguryeo and Silla. So why does a peninsula that, 2,000 years ago, was just 3 rival kingdoms squeezed between empires, end up here? A divided nation, one half wealthy and democratic, the other poor, isolated, and nuclear-armed. Because the geography never changed. Korea has always sat exactly where the interests of larger powers collide. Han China then, Tang China after, Qing China, Imperial Japan, the Soviet Union, the United States, and now a Russia at war and a China unwilling to lose influence. Every era finds a different set of outside powers with a reason to keep a hand on this peninsula. What changed is that, this time, the smaller power found a way to make itself indispensable to 2 of them at once, and armed itself so thoroughly that pushing it around stopped being a realistic option. That's the layer underneath the headlines about missile tests and Kremlin summits. A 2,000-year habit of survival, playing bigger neighbors against each other, refined into a strategy sharp enough to turn one of the world's poorest countries into one of its most heavily armed. If this kind of deep, connected history is what you come here for, make sure you're subscribed to Time Layers, because next time, we're going even further back to unravel another story hiding in plain sight. See you then.